Kelsey, her daughter-in-law, stood mid-scream, red wine dripping down her velvet dress, as Margaret, her mother-in-law, slid an eviction notice across the dinner table in gold silk gloves. "This can't be legal," Kelsey spat. Margaret smiled. "That's what probate court is for." Jeremy, Margaret's only son, said nothing, and the real will hadn't even been read yet. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." They mocked my black dress before the casket was even closed, but they forgot who paid for the funeral. The church smelled of lilies and old pews, the scent of mourning soaked into the wood like memory. Margaret stood near the front, still and poised, her black crepe dress falling neatly over her frame. It was modest, almost severe, something she'd worn once before, long ago, to her sister's funeral. Around her neck hung a string of old pearls, the same ones her husband had given her on their 10th anniversary, back when love meant something weightier than sentiment. She dabbed the corner of her eye, not because she was overwhelmed, but because too many eyes were watching. She grieved, certainly, but her tears were not for show. Theirs were. 2 rows behind, near the aisle, Kelsey leaned into her sister's ear and whispered with a stifled giggle, "Looks like she dressed from the clearance bin at a thrift store." Margaret heard it. She didn't flinch, just tilted her chin a little higher. After the service, guests filed slowly into the reception hall, a dimly lit annex where weak coffee and stale butter cookies attempted to pass for comfort. Kelsey drifted from person to person like a well-trained hostess at a networking event, dispensing plastic condolences between rehearsed stories. Her smile was perfect, her voice just the right pitch of sympathetic. Her eyes, however, kept flicking toward Margaret, calculating, assessing, undermining. When it came time for hugs, Kelsey approached with arms open and expression drawn into the universal face of pity. "You holding up okay?" she asked, as her gloved hands barely touched Margaret's shoulders. Margaret smiled faintly. "As well as can be expected." Kelsey's reply was saccharine. "Well, you know what they say. Time heals, and so do grandbabies." She placed her hand gently on her stomach. Margaret's smile tightened. That afternoon, Margaret barely spoke. She walked like she was floating, collected, composed, and invisible, just how Kelsey preferred her. By evening, the guests had long gone. The dishes were stacked and forgotten in the kitchen. Margaret stepped into her husband's study and closed the door behind her. The air inside felt thicker somehow. Dust particles danced in the last of the sunlight, filtering through the blinds, as though even the light hesitated to settle here. Everything was untouched. His reading glasses still rested on the arm of his favorite chair. A pen lay uncapped on the desk beside a leather-bound ledger, its pages closed, secrets kept. She walked to the bookshelf, fingers trailing spines, and paused at the small lacquered box on the top shelf. It had always been there. Ignored. Until now. She reached for it, pulled it down gently, and opened the velvet-lined interior. Inside sat a gold-embossed envelope, thick and weighty, marked in her husband's unmistakable handwriting. "Execute only if they forget who you are." Her fingers trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from anticipation. She took it to the desk, sat down slowly, and opened it. The first page was a letter. "Margaret, if you're reading this, then I was right. They've already started rewriting your worth. You were the spine of this family, the roof, the damn walls. I watched them chip at you while pretending you were lucky just to stand near them, but I made sure the foundation still belongs to you. Gold isn't just a color, Margaret. It's a message. When the time comes, wear it like armor. Love, James." Beneath the letter sat a thick, sealed folder, a copy of a will, dated and notarized, one she'd never seen before. She opened the first page. Her name appeared at the top. Margaret Elaine Holloway, primary executor and majority beneficiary. Jeremy's name followed, at a distant second. Kelsey's name wasn't there at all. The silence in the room shifted. Not empty. Empowered. She sat with it for a long time, letting the truth settle in her bones like steel. Her fingers rested on the letter. Her husband's voice echoed in her head, not as memory, but as marching orders. Wear it like armor. She reached for the phone, dialed the number from memory, and waited. After 2 rings, the line picked up. "This is Attorney Wilkins' office." Margaret's voice was calm, measured, sharp. "I think," she said, "it's time we opened the real will." The camera lingers on the gold envelope, still glowing faintly in the evening light, ready to rewrite everything. She hugged me in lace gloves. Her words were bare-knuckled. Margaret had once believed that silence kept peace, but as she poured herself a cup of tea that morning, loose chamomile leaves steeping in a china pot her husband once adored, she realized silence had only fed a monster she helped raise. Not Jeremy, but what he'd let her become. Kelsey. The sunlight hit the edge of the dining table, reflecting faint gold over the wood grain, just like it had when she and James used to sit here planning holiday dinners. Now the table felt colder, wider. Kelsey had insisted on new chairs last year. "The old ones creaked," she'd said. Margaret didn't miss the old chairs. She missed being asked. For years, she had tolerated Kelsey's needling under the guise of grace. Every backhanded compliment, every politely masked insult, she'd smiled through it, endured it, because that's what mothers-in-law were expected to do. But lately, something had shifted. Kelsey had stopped hiding the contempt altogether. "You know," she'd said the day before the funeral, brushing lint off Margaret's sleeve, "your dress is sweet, very 1950s widow." Adds a nice vintage touch, she'd smiled as she said it. Lace gloves on, words like brass knuckles underneath. Margaret hadn't replied. She hadn't needed to. She just tilted her head, as if cataloging Kelsey like a rare artifact, curious but irrelevant. And Jeremy? He had chuckled. Not cruelly, not loudly, but enough. Enough to tell Margaret exactly where his loyalty lived now. It wasn't with the woman who gave him her maiden name when he was born. It was with the one who wore heels on hardwood and smiled while replacing family history with Pinterest decor. Margaret's hands were still steady as she arrived at the law office the next morning. No tremble, no hesitation. She wore the same black gloves she had at the funeral, not for mourning now, but as a quiet barrier between the woman she'd been and the woman stepping out of that grief. The receptionist, a young woman with clipped hair and pearl earrings, gave her a soft smile. "Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Wilkins is expecting you. Conference room B." Margaret nodded and walked slowly down the hallway, her heels tapping against the tile like a ticking clock. The room was small, warm, and paneled in dark wood. Attorney Wilkins stood as she entered, his expression a mix of sympathy and curiosity. "Thank you for coming on short notice," he said, gesturing toward the leather chair across from him. Margaret sat, smoothing her skirt, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I found the envelope," she said. Wilkins leaned forward slightly. "The gold one?" She nodded. "And the letter. The one only meant for me." There was a pause before he reached beneath the desk and pulled out a sealed folder, thicker than the one she'd seen at home. The envelope was crisp, stamped with an older date, and sealed with a red wax insignia she recognized immediately. James's personal seal. "This," Wilkins said carefully, placing the envelope in front of her, "is the second will, the final one. It was never filed." Margaret's eyebrows rose, but her voice remained even. "Why not?" He gave a small smile. "Because he instructed us to wait. He said you'd know when." Margaret picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than it looked. "What's inside," he said, "was designed to be read when the performance ended and the curtain dropped, legally binding, ironclad." Margaret looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And now?" He nodded once, slowly. "Now. It begins." Margaret traces the edge of the envelope with one gloved finger. Her voice is quiet, but resolute. "Then let's turn the page. My husband knew they'd fake tears. That's why he gave me real power. The will didn't just name her, it armed her." Margaret sat by the fireplace, the glow of the flames flickering across her lap as she turned each page of the document slowly, deliberately. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic scratch of dry logs settling in the hearth and the occasional crackle of firewood surrendering to heat. She wore her reading glasses low on her nose, her breath steady, her heart not so much racing as realigning. She had expected money, maybe even the house. But this? This was strategy. The will wasn't a rushed rewrite. It was precise, dated, witnessed, notarized. Her name was listed as primary executor and majority beneficiary. The language was firm and unequivocal. Jeremy's name appeared farther down, next to a modest line item, a small trust with fixed terms. Kelsey's name? Nowhere. Margaret tilted her head slightly, no anger, just confirmation. James had seen it coming. She turned the page and found a smaller envelope tucked inside. Her name was written across it in his script, steady, confident, unflinching. She opened it and pulled out a single sheet. Margaret, if you're holding this, then it's happened. You've been dismissed, diminished, and likely dressed down. I've watched Kelsey manipulate conversations, gestures, even Jeremy's loyalties. I couldn't stop him from drifting, but I could protect you from the wreckage. You always believed the home was ours. Now it legally is. Yours. The study safe holds the last pieces. The deed, the letters, the clause. Read them all. Then decide what you want the next act to look like. James Margaret folded the letter gently, as though handling something sacred. Then she stood, walked upstairs, and entered the study. The study smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Her husband's presence still clung to the leather chair, the bookshelf, even the creaky floorboard near the desk that always squeaked when someone leaned too far left. She crossed to the tall bookshelf on the far wall, the one they rarely touched anymore. On the bottom shelf, behind a row of outdated atlases, sat a locked metal box. The safe. She knelt slowly, the old key still tucked inside her locket chain. It clicked open with the sound of soft defiance. Inside, the original deed to the property, dated before Kelsey ever entered their lives. A series of typed letters, each stapled neatly, each dated and signed by James. And one thin folder marked, Golden Clause, Public Reading Required. She picked up the letters first. Each one was a record of something Kelsey said, or something she did, or how she tried to convince James to simplify their estate, sell the house, liquidate the assets, and modernize their legacy for the next generation. James had documented every word, every shift in tone, every dinner conversation that ended in concern. He hadn't been paranoid. He'd been planning. Margaret moved to the desk and sat in the same chair her husband once did when writing these letters. She opened the thin folder. The Golden Clause wasn't just a poetic phrase, it was a legal mechanism, a stipulation that, upon his death, allowed for a secondary will to be triggered, if and only if the primary beneficiary, Margaret, believed his wishes were being manipulated or misrepresented. The condition? The contents of the Golden Clause had to be read publicly, no private negotiations, no soft landings. The theater of truth had to be opened before an audience. Margaret stared at the clause, her pulse now steady in a way that felt strangely powerful. This wasn't revenge, it was restoration. Her phone buzzed softly on the table beside her. A text from Jeremy. Mom, Kelsey thinks we should meet soon to talk about the house. Just options. Nothing final. Let us know when you're ready to chat. She didn't respond. Instead, she looked out the window, where the early evening sun had begun to dip behind the bare trees. The light turned the curtains gold. James had known they'd fake tears. That's why he gave her something real. Margaret picks up the folder, runs her fingers across the embossed label, and whispers to the empty room, "Then let's make it public." Kelsey kept smiling for sympathy. I kept stacking receipts. The invitation never arrived, but Margaret was already dressed. She stood at the edge of her vanity mirror, adjusting the cufflinks her husband once wore for his retirement gala, engraved gold, subtle but unmistakable. They glinted beneath her tailored blazer sleeve as she reached for her earrings, ignoring the buzzing silence from her phone. There were no messages, no calls, not from Jeremy, certainly not from Kelsey, but she knew exactly where they would be. The brunch was held at a garden cafe off the main square, a polished venue with white trellises laced in faux ivy and floral arrangements that looked as if they'd been curated by a lifestyle influencer. Peonies, of course, her late husband's least favorite flower. Overpriced lettuce, he used to joke. Margaret smiled at the memory as she stepped through the wrought iron gates, uninvited but not unwelcome. The hostess blinked when she arrived. "Oh, are you here for the Holloway brunch?" Margaret gave a gentle smile and nodded. "Family." She said it like a challenge. From the edge of the terrace, Margaret watched the scene unfold like theater. Kelsey was holding court, wrapped in a flowy cream blouse and pastel skirt, hair swept into a messy but perfect bun. Her makeup was delicate, smudged just enough to hint at grief, not too much to ruin a photo. "And I told Jeremy," Kelsey was saying to a group of wide-eyed women, "she's just so fragile now. Barely holding on. I mean, she could fall over mid-toast and none of us would notice." The women laughed softly, uncertain. Then came the line. Casual, cutting. "I give her a year, maybe less if the wind picks up." Margaret's hand was already in her coat pocket, fingers curled around the small recorder she'd brought just in case. Click. Capture. She turned slightly to the left. Jeremy was standing nearby, drink in hand, awkwardly chuckling. Not fully joining in, but not stopping it either. Her son had learned to smile through discomfort, but not to stand through it. Margaret moved through the crowd with grace, offering small nods to acquaintances who looked surprised to see her. No one asked why she hadn't been on the guest list. No one dared. She made it to the buffet table, where a young server struggled to balance a tray of sparkling cider flutes. "Charge this to the family account, please," Margaret said smoothly, removing her card and handing it to him before Kelsey could spot her. "No gratuity cap." The young man blinked, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am?" The brunch bill was hers now, every penny of it. Kelsey turned at last, mid-laugh, her eyes catching Margaret's across the table. Her smile froze. Margaret raised her glass. "To James," she said simply. A few guests hesitated, lifted their flutes out of politeness. Kelsey did not move. Her posture tightened like a wire pulled too far. But Margaret had already turned away. She had what she came for. Back home, the afternoon light angled across her study floor as she placed the tiny recorder into the drawer beside the Golden Claws folder. She added the brunch receipt, neatly folded, marked with the cafe's logo and a line item total that included imported wine Kelsey had ordered with no idea someone else was footing the bill. She slid both into a labeled envelope. Performance evidence, brunch. Then, without fanfare, she picked up her phone and dialed the law office. When the assistant answered, Margaret's tone was as crisp as her collar. "I'd like to file the petition to execute the Golden Clause, public reading as required." A pause, the sound of a keyboard clacking on the other end. "Understood. Shall we prepare for a state notification?" Margaret's lips curved faintly. "Oh yes," she said. "Let's make sure the audience is full." The screen fades to black as the brunch receipt lands gently in the filing tray marked, "To be served. Funerals are for mourning. Will readings are for resurrection." They were already seated when the doors opened. And when Margaret entered, draped in gold from shoulder to hem, Kelsey blinked as if the room had been set on fire. The family estate's drawing room had been transformed for the occasion. Rows of high-backed chairs lined the walnut floors. A long table stood at the front, draped in navy linen, where the attorney had placed a single black folder, sealed and waiting. Sunlight bled through the tall windows, refracting off Margaret's silk gown with every step she took. Her hair was pinned in soft waves, a nod to the way James once liked it. Around her neck rested her wedding pearls. On her wrist, the gold bracelet she hadn't worn since their 40th anniversary. She carried no purse, no coat, just herself, armored in elegance. Kelsey leaned over to Jeremy, whispering behind a brittle smile. Did she think this was a fashion show? Jeremy didn't respond. He just cleared his throat and looked straight ahead. Margaret walked past them without so much as a glance. The sound of her heels on the floor was the only thing that spoke. The attorney stood. "Shall we begin?" Margaret gave a small nod and took the seat at the end of the front row, alone, but not lonely. Wilkins adjusted his glasses and held up the sealed envelope. "This," he began, "is a legally executed, notarized and witnessed version of Mr. James Holloway's final will and testament, one that supersedes all previous iterations. It was held in private custody per his explicit instructions to be activated by his wife, Margaret Elaine Holloway, upon her request." He let the words sink. Kelsey leaned forward, eyebrows pinched. "Wait, I thought we already—" Wilkins opened the folder. "This," he said again, "is not the will you know." The room shifted. You could feel it, like air exiting the lungs of every seated guest at once. He began reading. To Margaret, full ownership of the estate, the family investments, and all heirlooms held in trust. To Jeremy, a fixed monthly stipend held in escrow, contingent upon annual in-person review with the family estate lawyer. To Kelsey, nothing, no property, no assets, no recognition. A sharp breath escaped Kelsey. She laughed once, short and brittle, like glass cracking under pressure. "This has to be a joke." Wilkins didn't look up. "I assure you, it is not." Margaret didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her chin slightly tilted, as if watching a storm roll over someone else's house. Kelsey's voice rose. "This can't be legal." Wilkins looked at her now, voice cool. "That's what probate court is for." Kelsey surged to her feet. "You can't just erase me like that. I've been his daughter-in-law for over a decade. I handled his medical records. I booked appointments. You arranged brunch?" Margaret said quietly, not turning around. "And you insulted me before his ashes cooled." The silence that followed was merciless. Kelsey's cheeks flushed with rage. She looked to Jeremy, but he was already looking down, hands clasped tight. Margaret stood slowly. "There's a reason my husband kept the truth locked away," she said. "It wasn't to hurt you, it was to protect what you kept trying to hollow out." Kelsey opened her mouth to argue, but Margaret had already turned. She walked back down the aisle with the same grace she entered, gold silk rippling behind her like a curtain falling on the final act. Outside, the breeze lifted strands of her hair. The sun caught the edges of her dress and made it glow like something divine. She paused at the estate gates and glanced back once, not at the house, not at Jeremy, and certainly not at Kelsey, but at the memory of the man who'd once said, "Gold isn't just a color, Margaret, it's a message." Inside the estate, Kelsey's voice trembles as she shouts after her, "You haven't heard the last of this." Wilkins calmly shuts the folder. "No," he says, "but she'll have the last word." I wore pearls for peace, but peace was never her goal. The first post appeared 2 days after the will reading. A close-up of a framed photo, Margaret and James at a gala, decades ago, cropped just enough to exclude the golden necklace that now hung around Margaret's neck. The caption, written in faux sympathy font, read, "He built everything." She erased it in silk and signatures. By the end of the week, Kelsey had posted 6 more, one with a black and white filter. "He never wanted the family divided." One with a moody piano track in the background. "Some people mourn with class. Others lawyer up and gut what's left." Margaret watched none of them in full. She didn't need to. Every frame reeked of vanity disguised as victimhood. Every caption was a dagger dulled by desperation. She sipped her tea in the study, pearls glinting against her skin, fingers scrolling slowly through the screenshots her assistant had printed and bound in a plain manila folder titled Digital Defamation, Exhibit A. Margaret didn't post rebuttals. She didn't comment. She didn't text. She filed. Wilkins raised an eyebrow when she handed him the folder at their next meeting. "Passive aggression meets passive litigation," he murmured, flipping through the screenshots. "She's good, almost slippery." Margaret gave a calm smile. "But not invisible." He looked up. "You're not going to respond publicly?" She shook her head once. "I wore pearls to bury a man. I won't use them to outshout a child playing widow online." Wilkins grinned. "Then let's do what your husband would have done. Paper over pixels." That afternoon, Margaret returned to the estate. She moved with purpose, her heels soft against the tile as she walked into James's old private office, the one even Jeremy rarely entered. The wall safe sat behind a false panel, hidden beneath a row of antique books. Margaret pressed the latch, input the code, James's chess rating, of course, and turned the brass wheel until the mechanism unlocked with a heavy click. Inside, time had frozen. Notarized letters, legal envelopes, documented memos, all signed by James. She sat down at the oak desk, the papers spread before her like a confession. The first few letters were methodical, dated observations, records of Kelsey's attempts to influence estate planning, notes about her suggesting early inheritance reallocations and equity distribution while living. Then came the last letter, folded into a separate file. Margaret unfolded it slowly. It was a scanned copy of a property draft, Kelsey's handwriting forged on the signature line, just above a clause about rights to liquidate assets from the estate. James had circled it in red ink. He'd written in the margin, "Caught before submission. Not destroyed. Keep if needed." Margaret exhaled. No one else knew this existed. Until now. She slid the document into a new folder and handed it to Wilkins at their next meeting. His expression shifted from mild interest to sharpened focus. This is actual forgery. She would have needed power of attorney to even attempt this legally. She didn't have it, Margaret said calmly. She had audacity. Wilkins nodded slowly, already reaching for his phone. "With this," he said, "we can file for defamation, will tampering, and potential fraudulent misrepresentation." He paused, then looked Margaret dead in the eye. "Want to shut her down?" Margaret's voice was soft, but her eyes were steel. "I want her to hear silence when she screams." Wilkins places the document into a protective sleeve and locks it in a case. "Then it's time she finds out," he says. "Some legacies don't bend. They bite. They raised a toast to my husband. I raised a fork and served justice." The silver clink of cutlery echoed softly across the long mahogany table, but the real knife was still in Margaret's purse. It wasn't steel. It was paper, and it would cut far deeper than anything served with wine. The dining room glowed under the soft haze of chandeliers, the table dressed in crisp white linen and gold-edged plates. It was the first formal gathering since the funeral. Margaret had organized it quietly, selectively. Only James's oldest friends, a few trusted neighbors, and one reporter from a lifestyle column sat around the table. The theme wasn't grief, it was gratitude, legacy. A small card sat at each place setting, "In honor of James Holloway, a life worth defending." Margaret wore a navy blue sheath dress with a gold brooch near her shoulder. Her hair was swept back into a loose twist, and her pearls, always her pearls, sat at her throat like quiet sentinels. She raised her wine glass and offered a simple toast. "To a man who built his name with patience and his home with principle." The room responded with a warm chorus of lifted glasses. And then the door opened. Kelsey entered uninvited, wrapped in black velvet like mourning had suddenly become fashionable again. Her heels tapped too loudly against the marble. Her smile, stiff and theatrical, reached no further than her cheekbones. "Oh, what a surprise," she cooed, walking in as if the room belonged to her. Jeremy followed behind like a man forced to chase his own shadow. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply gestured toward the vacant seat at the far end of the table. "We set a place," she said lightly, "in case a ghost arrived." A few polite chuckles. One cough, one exchanged glance. Kelsey sat, smoothing her skirt. "Don't mind me. I'm just here to honor James." Margaret nodded slowly. "Of course. Everyone's here to honor him." Dinner continued. Lamb medallions, rosemary potatoes, a citrus vinaigrette salad. Margaret smiled through it all, letting the tension stretch like a violin string tuned just a hair too tight. Kelsey kept drinking. Jeremy kept glancing, and Margaret kept watching the minutes tick toward dessert. When the plates were cleared, she reached beneath her napkin and pulled out a thin white envelope. She slid it across the table to Kelsey, perfectly centered between their water glasses. "For you." Kelsey blinked. "What's this? A truce?" Margaret tilted her head. "A timeline." Kelsey opened the envelope and read the first line. Her posture faltered. Then her hand began to tremble as she flipped to the second page. Formal eviction notice, pending civil suit, defamation and document tampering. You can't be serious. Margaret sipped her wine. Oh, I am. Kelsey stood abruptly, knocking over her glass. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like a wound. Gasps circled the table. You vindictive old... Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't even rise. She simply set down her fork, wiped her mouth with her napkin, and looked Kelsey in the eyes. You were never part of the family trust, Kelsey, she said softly. Only the performance surrounding it. Silence. Like gravity had taken hold of everyone's throat at once. The lifestyle reporter blinked, fingers instinctively brushing the edge of her notebook. Across the table, one of James's war buddies muttered, "Damn right." Kelsey's breathing became ragged. She looked to Jeremy. "Say something." But Jeremy said nothing. Not yet. Margaret rose at last, her napkin folded neatly in hand. "This dinner," she said to the room, "was to honor what my husband built. But more importantly, what he protected." She turned to the server standing near the entryway. "Please walk Miss Kelsey out. She seems misaligned with the guest list." As Kelsey is guided toward the door, her voice echoes down the hallway. "You haven't heard the last of me." Margaret doesn't look back. She just says, calmly, finally, "No, but I have heard the last of your lies. They thought they could run my house. Now they can't find the gate code." At precisely 7 a.m., the old iron gates didn't open. For the first time in 20 years, Jeremy's access code failed. He pressed the numbers again, slower this time, 3-7-1-9, a buzz, a pause, then nothing. The keypad blinked back at him like an eye that no longer recognized its own blood. Margaret stood at the upstairs window, her silk robe gently catching the morning light. She watched her son from behind the sheer curtains, his figure small beyond the hedges. His hand went to his phone. She didn't need to check, she knew it was ringing. She let it. 3 rings. 4. Voicemail. Downstairs, 2 locksmith vans idled in the gravel driveway. One for the front doors, one for the service entrance. Margaret had scheduled both before dawn. Efficiency was a kind of revenge, too. A woman in a beige uniform emerged from the driver's seat, clipboard in hand. Margaret met her at the foyer. "We'll need access to the breaker panel," the woman said. Margaret nodded. "You'll find it behind the grandfather clock. I've already labeled the circuits." A beat passed before the woman gave a faint smile. "You've done this before?" Margaret returned it. "Number, but I've been planning for a very long time." By midday, every lock was changed. The garage remotes were reprogrammed. The staff, the ones who mattered, had been personally notified. The gardener bowed his head when Margaret passed him near the hydrangeas. "Always respected Mr. Holloway," he murmured. "And you?" She paused. "Thank you, Ben. That means more than you know." He nodded once, went back to trimming the hedges. Loyalty wasn't loud. It was consistent. Jeremy showed up an hour later, knocking, not at the front, but at the kitchen entrance. Margaret opened the door halfway. His face was pale, eyes lined with exhaustion. "Mom," he started, "this is crazy." She said nothing. "I know Kelsey went too far. I know. But locking me out? Changing codes? What am I supposed to do, just disappear?" Still, she was quiet, so he tried again. "This was our house too." That's when she pulled out the photograph. It was printed on thick paper, the corners frayed from time and memory. James's handwriting sat at the bottom in blue ink, beneath a snapshot of the 2 of them standing beside the foundation of the estate. Before walls, before windows. If he can't protect his mother, he doesn't deserve the house. Jeremy read it, and broke. He didn't scream. He didn't argue. He just lowered his head into his hands and sank onto the garden bench behind him. "I thought I was doing what she wanted," he said into his palms. "I didn't know how to be between you 2. Margaret exhaled. "That was your choice," she said softly. "And now this is mine." She shut the door. Not hard, just final. Inside, the house hummed with new life. Margaret walked room to room, sketchpad in hand. The floral wallpaper in the guest hall would go first. The library would be restored, real wood shelves, not the plastic ones Kelsey had installed for a cleaner look. She passed James's study and paused at the threshold. She didn't enter. Not yet. Some rooms deserved their own ceremony. By sunset, the windows glowed gold. Margaret stood in the dining room, her eyes scanning paint swatches lined up along the wall. She didn't need to erase Kelsey. She just had to reclaim herself. That night, her lawyer called. "Kelsey just filed for an emergency injunction," he said. "She's contesting the eviction and claiming emotional distress." Margaret tilted her head toward the night sky beyond the window. And the court date's been set. It's going public." Margaret's voice was calm. "Then I'll make sure they remember which house they're stepping into." She thought court would be her stage. She didn't realize I held the spotlight. Kelsey wore black again, this time not for mourning, but for optics. Her veil of grief was now tailored into a pencil skirt, a pearl blouse, and a lawyer-approved sympathetic tilt to her voice. But the court wasn't lit for her. It was lit for the truth. And today, Margaret brought the match. The courtroom was smaller than expected. High ceilings, pale green walls, and a chandelier that buzzed faintly with electricity. Not elegant enough for drama, but just grand enough to remind everyone. The consequences here were real. Margaret sat silently at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Wilkins and his junior associate. Her dress was slate gray, clean, quiet, unbothered. The only color was a thin line of red lipstick, perfectly applied. Across the aisle, Kelsey sat stiff-backed, dabbing at her nose with a tissue even before proceedings began. Jeremy sat behind her. Not at the table, not beside her. Behind. Judge Holloway, no relation, entered, robe swinging. The room stood, then settled. Kelsey's attorney stood first. A tall man with perfectly parted hair and a voice like a museum guide. He painted Kelsey as emotionally devastated, illegally displaced, and denied basic dignity in the wake of family tragedy. "She is not contesting the grief of loss," he said. "She is contesting the cruelty of being treated like a stranger in her own husband's family home." Margaret didn't move, not even an eyebrow. Let him talk. Let the chandelier keep humming above them like it knew who was lying. Then it was Wilkins's turn. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "what we have here is not grief. It is opportunism." He clicked a remote. The first slide projected onto the courtroom monitor. A dated letter, signed by James Holloway. "To whom it may concern. I have noticed increasingly coercive behavior by my son's wife regarding our estate. Page after page appeared, recorded, notarized, some even time-stamped video clips." Kelsey shifted in her seat, visibly flushing. Her lawyer objected, citing context. "Overruled," the judge replied without even looking up. Margaret finally spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "My husband kept receipts, Your Honor," she said. "Not just because he didn't trust her, but because he trusted me." She turned to face the monitor. A grainy video clip began playing, Kelsey at the brunch weeks prior, laughing. "She can barely stand. I give her a year." The courtroom murmured. Wilkins clicked again. A document. Kelsey's handwriting. Attempted signature. A forged draft of the estate transfer. The judge's face stiffened. "This," Wilkins said, "was caught before submission. But intent, Your Honor, is everything." The judge turned his attention to Kelsey. Her mouth opened, but no sound followed. She shrunk behind her attorney's file as if paper could act as a shield. Then, the final name on the witness list was called. Jeremy Holloway. He stood slowly, walked forward, raised his hand, swore the oath, and sat. Wilkins stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, did you know about your wife's suggestions to your father regarding the estate?" Jeremy hesitated. "Did you know about her attempt to influence your father's will?" Silence. And then, "Yes," Jeremy said, voice barely audible. "I knew. I just let her lead." The words dropped like iron into the courtroom. Kelsey stared at him in disbelief. What are you saying?" Jeremy looked at Margaret, then the floor. "That I failed," he said. The judge rapped his gavel once. "Thank you. I've heard enough for today. Ruling will be delivered in 48 hours. As people began to rise, Margaret remained seated, staring straight ahead, her voice soft but steady. The chandelier may flicker, but the truth always finds its light. He wore the tie his father left him, but forgot what it stood for. Jeremy wore the golden tie to the verdict hearing. He thought it might soften the edges, remind his mother of birthdays, old dinners, his father's hand resting on his shoulder. But some legacies aren't stitched in silk. They're sealed in trust papers and rewritten with grief. The courtroom had emptied hours earlier. Now, under a bleached sky, Jeremy stood at the edge of the estate's gravel driveway, his phone buzzing against his palm. The email subject line glared at him like a warning. Notice of beneficiary removal, Holloway Family Trust. He opened it, read the first 3 lines, and exhaled like someone punched him in the gut. Inside the house, Margaret stood by the fireplace, watching the logs collapse into ember. Wilkins sat across from her in an armchair, folding a document slowly back into its envelope. "It's finalized," he said. "All access revoked. No more discretionary funds? No more investment leverage? Legally clean." Margaret nodded once. "No loopholes?" "None. You covered them all 6 months ago." She didn't smile, but something in her jaw unclenched. A memory flickered. James sitting right there in that same chair, the morning after his first surgery, his voice quieter than usual. "If I don't make it to next winter, promise me you'll take full control. Don't wait. Don't ask for permission to protect what we built." Back in the study, Margaret opened the hidden ledger. An elegant black notebook, pages lined with handwritten account notes, passwords, and sealed authorizations James had left behind. His signature sat beneath a line that read, "Emergency financial control to Margaret Elaine Holloway, effective immediately upon my passing." She'd never planned to use it, until she had to. Downstairs, the housekeeper stepped into the drawing room. "There's a woman from the county registrar on the line. She said you filed a property lien notice?" Margaret turned. "Yes, on the Glenwood cabin. Donate it to the Widows' Support Fund. Let them turn it into a shelter." The housekeeper paused. "The whole property?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Half the estate proceeds. I only need one home. The rest should go to women who were told to wait their turn." Meanwhile, across town, Kelsey stood frozen in front of her laptop, scrolling through her bank app again. Account frozen. Funds under review. Each tap of her red acrylic nails against the table grew louder. Fraud investigation? What fraud? She clicked through emails, then messages, until she saw it. A forwarded report from the Holloway Legal Counsel, a statement signed by James, dated 2 years before his death. "My financial records are not to be altered or redirected by Kelsey Holloway under any circumstance. I have witnessed attempts to bypass financial review, documenting for potential legal relevance." Kelsey threw the mouse across the room. Back at the estate, Margaret stood at the iron gate with a watering can, pretending to tend the azaleas. That's when she saw it. An envelope. Plain white, tucked halfway under the mailbox flap, without postage or handwriting. She picked it up. Opened it. One sentence, printed in a typewriter font. "You'll regret this. You can't erase family blood with gold ink." She stared at the note, wind pressing her skirt softly against her legs. A nearby car engine revved. She turned, but the street was already empty. Inside, she placed the letter on the kitchen counter and picked up the landline. "Wilkins," she said when he answered. "I've just received something." "Threat?" "Anonymous. Cowardly." He sighed. "I'll get the security team to review camera footage." Margaret looked out the window at the sky, clouds curling into soft gray fingers. "I'm not worried," she said. "I just want to know which one of them is still trying to play chess with checkers." That evening, under the soft light of a desk lamp, Margaret took out a fresh piece of stationery and wrote a single sentence. "Blood may be thicker than water, but legacy doesn't bleed." She sealed it, addressed it with no name, and handed it to Wilkins the next morning. "Just in case," she said. "They tried to intimidate me with shadows. I walked straight into the sun." The envelope wasn't handwritten. The message inside wasn't signed. But Margaret recognized the venom as easily as perfume on a scarf. "You think you've won, but legacy doesn't belong to liars." A pause. Then a second line etched in careful typewriter font. Some stories can still be rewritten, even in gold. She read the letter twice under the kitchen's pale morning light, the tips of her fingers pressed to the marble countertop to steady her thoughts. Outside, the wind nudged the garden chimes into a soft, nervous melody. Margaret didn't flinch. She folded the paper once, slowly. Then again. No panic. Just purpose. By mid-afternoon, Wilkins had the entire estate team on alert. "It was printed," he said, voice clipped, "on a very specific textured stock. Boutique. Boutique usually means bold." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Or desperate." He glanced at his laptop. "We traced the phone number used to contact a courier. It was a burner, but the location pinged near East River, close to Jeremy and Kelsey's old apartment." "And the courier?" she asked. Wilkins leaned forward. "Was paid in cash? No camera trail. But the signature required to receive the envelope? Guess who accepted it on Kelsey's behalf at her new rental address?" Margaret's lips barely moved. She never knew when to quit. By sunset, Wilkins had filed the police report, contacted a judge, and returned with one more thing: a manila folder stamped "Temporary Restraining Order," active in bold across the top. "Delivery confirmed by tomorrow morning," he said. "She won't be allowed within 100 feet of the property. Or you." Margaret didn't thank him with words. She walked to the hallway, safe, unlocked it, and pulled out a small box. A gift from James, unopened until now. Inside, a gold-plated fountain pen, and a note in his familiar hand. "If they try to silence you, write louder." She held it, not as a keepsake, but as a weapon. That night, while the estate's new motion sensor lights flickered softly along the walkway, Margaret stood outside with the lead installer. "Camera angles must cover the gate, the mailbox, and the side hedges," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And the footage backs up daily?" "To the cloud and a physical drive." She nodded, then paused to look out into the night. The air carried a hint of rosewood from the freshly trimmed bushes, and somewhere a fox barked twice, short, startled, and distant. It reminded her, predators only sound dangerous until they're cornered. The next morning, Margaret dressed simply: charcoal slacks, a soft ivory sweater, and the smallest touch of blush. No jewelry, just a canvas tote filled with books, sealed envelopes, and a check marked for donation. She arrived at the town's community library just after 10. The space was quiet, sun pouring in through tall windows and onto the polished floor. A volunteer at the desk looked up, startled. "Mrs. Holloway?" "I have a delivery," Margaret said, "and a promise to keep." She stepped into the central atrium, where the donor wall had just been updated with golden plates, engraved names of benefactors, new and old. Her hand hesitated as she found it. James Holloway, 2007. And directly beneath it, newly mounted, Margaret E. Holloway, 2023. The lettering shimmered under the skylight. She smiled. Not because her name was there, but because it sat beside his. Not behind. Not below. Beside. As she stepped back to leave, the receptionist called out softly, "There's a letter for you, Mrs. Holloway. Left just this morning." She frowned. Took the envelope. Inside, no words this time. Just a single item. A torn photograph. Her wedding photo. With her face slashed clean through. "They fought for the house. I made it someone else's." The house echoed now, not with voices but with the sound of absence, a heel clicking across bare hardwood, a cabinet creaking open one last time, and the soft whisper of tape being pulled across the top of a box. Not packed in haste, packed with peace. Margaret stood in the center of the study, James's old domain, watching the afternoon sun slice through the tall windows. She had already taken the only 3 things she wanted from this room: the gold, embossed ledger, the framed photograph of them at the cabin, and a paperweight shaped like an eagle. Everything else? Staying. For someone else to discover or discard. She didn't care anymore. Not because it didn't matter, but because she had already taken what mattered with her. The listing had been private, quiet, and fast. No agents, no tours, just one conversation, through Wilkins, with the director of the Westwood Artists Foundation. By the time Jeremy caught wind of it, the paperwork was already in escrow. He showed up at the gate again, this time not in a suit, but in a windbreaker and jeans, looking less like the son of the estate and more like a man who didn't belong there anymore. Margaret met him at the front porch. "You're selling it?" he asked. "Just like that?" "No," she said. "Not just like that. Like this." She handed him the deed. His name was nowhere on it. "Why?" he asked. "This house is our family." She smiled softly. "You sold me out for a woman in heels, Jeremy. I walk alone now." He blinked, mouth open, but no words came. She didn't wait for him to find them. She turned and walked back inside. The estate sold for 1/3 under market value intentionally. The buyer, a nonprofit focused on giving women artists a space to create, heal, and begin again. They would convert the West Wing into a ceramics studio, the East Solarium into an open gallery. Margaret didn't ask for naming rights, but she did ask that one rule be enforced. Let them paint the walls whatever color they want. Freedom, after all, shouldn't come with beige ceilings. She packed sparingly, a box of her favorite books, dog-eared, underlined, marked with faint pencil notes in the margins, 2 canvases from her earlier work, her painting supplies, old brushes, stained aprons, jars filled with dried colors still clinging to the edges, and 1 gown, the gold one. The same one they laughed at when she wore it to the will reading, the same one she now folded gently, carefully, as if it were a crown made of silk. The lakefront cottage she bought had no gate, no chandelier, and no grand dining room. But the light poured in from the east each morning, and the dock creaked just enough to feel real under her feet. The deed was in her name alone. And for once, that didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. Back at the estate, movers shuffled the last box into the truck. The room stood hollow now, stripped of rugs and curtains, voices and friction. Margaret walked through one final time. She paused in each doorway, not to remember, but to release. The guest bedroom, where Kelsey once threw a fit over missing linens. The kitchen, where Jeremy once burned toast and blamed the toaster. The master bath, where James once knocked over a perfume bottle just to make her laugh. She touched the frame of the door leading to the study, then turned toward the foyer. As she reached the front steps, a breeze kicked up behind her, sending a loose napkin from the dining table fluttering into the air. She caught it mid-flight, held it for a moment, then tucked it into her coat pocket. Just because. The last thing she expected was a knock. 3 raps, not loud, not frantic. She turned slowly, hand still resting on the front door handle. Through the glass panel, a shadow stood, tall, unfamiliar. Not Jeremy, not Kelsey, a stranger, holding a small box wrapped in twine and a letter with her name in gold. They wanted legacy. I gave them absence. The knock on the door didn't echo. It settled, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for wind, but Margaret knew. This one wasn't a threat, it was an arrival, and it would change the definition of air forever. She opened the door slowly, hand still damp from the final sweep of packing. The air outside had shifted, cooler than expected for spring. A storm was likely coming, but it wasn't in the sky. It was standing on her porch. A young woman, maybe 28, stood beneath a pale gray coat. Her hair was tucked beneath a knitted hat, her boots worn, practical. She wasn't shaking, just still. In her hands, a small box wrapped in twine and an envelope with Margaret Holloway handwritten in deep green ink. "Mrs. Holloway?" the woman asked gently. "Yes?" I'm sorry to come unannounced. I wasn't sure this address would still be active." Margaret didn't nod, didn't invite her in. She simply waited. "My name is Clara." The woman hesitated, then extended the box. "My father was James Holloway." Margaret's breath caught mid-chest. The name landed like a dropped teacup, quiet at first, until the cracks spread wide. "I think you may have known about me, or maybe not," Clara continued. "He met my mother before he met you. Nothing ever official, but he left this with a lawyer. It took years to find me. He said to deliver it only if the family estate changed hands." Margaret took the envelope. Her hands didn't shake. She opened it. Inside, a second will, dated 4 months before his death. Not a replacement, an addendum. One line, handwritten beneath the formal clause, "If Clara ever finds her way back to this door, know that she has my eyes. And she deserves a window of her own." James Margaret said nothing for a long time. Then, "Would you like tea?" Clara's mouth parted in surprise. "Yes, please." Inside, the kettle hissed, and the scent of dried lavender and lemon peel filled the small kitchen. They sat across from each other at the round table, the untouched lake stretching behind them through the wide glass doors. "So he knew?" Margaret finally asked. "About you?" Clara nodded. "He met me once, when I was 6. My mother didn't want anything from him, she just wanted him to know. He gave me a music box. I still have it." Margaret folded her hands around the mug. "He told me everything before he died, except you. I'm sorry." "Don't be. He didn't hide you out of shame. He probably hid you to protect you from the rest of us." Clara smiled. "That sounds like him." Later that evening, Margaret opened her safe and pulled out the official copy of her will. Her lawyer had added sticky notes beside every clause, bright yellow reminders of everything she planned to leave behind. She took out a pen, crossed out one name, added another. No announcement. No dramatic moment. Just ink and decision. She left nothing for Jeremy, nothing for Kelsey. They'd fought for her gold like it was an inheritance. But gold, as she'd come to realize, wasn't just metal. It was choice. And she had made hers. The next morning, she and Clara stood in front of a small fire pit behind the lake cottage. Clara held a photo, an old black and white of James, Kelsey, Jeremy, and Margaret, seated around a brunch table, all mid-laugh. "They look happy," Clara said. "They were rehearsing it," Margaret replied. She tossed the photo into the flames. One by one, they fed in more. A portrait of the Holloways taken the year Kelsey moved in. A framed print of Jeremy's graduation with his mother smirking behind him. A birthday photo with a gift bag from a store Margaret never shopped at. All of them curled and blackened in silence, until there was nothing left but ash, crackling softly in the spring wind. Later that afternoon, Margaret returned inside to find a cream-colored envelope slipped beneath the front door. The return address was printed in embossed gold, the National Conference for Modern Widowhood and Female Legacy, Washington, D.C. She opened it with a letter opener shaped like a hummingbird, Clara's gift. Inside, the letter read, "Your story has inspired hundreds. We formally invite you to be our keynote speaker for this year's event. We believe you've redefined what legacy means." Margaret folded the letter back into the envelope, turned toward the lake where Clara now stood with a sketchpad in hand, and smiled. She didn't say yes, but she reached for her gold dress and laid it on the bed, just in case. Widows wear black, warriors wear gold. Margaret hadn't touched a paintbrush in nearly 10 years, not since James fell sick, not since the house turned from a home into a battleground. But that morning, with a fresh canvas staring her down and peace finally anchored in her chest, she dipped the bristles in gold and let it speak for her. The lake cottage was small by comparison, no marble foyers, no staff echoing in hallways. But the silence here wasn't hollow. It was chosen, alive. Every creak of the floorboard, every hum of wind through pine trees reminded her she was the only heartbeat in the room, and that she belonged in it. The living room had become her studio. A single easel faced the wall of windows overlooking the lake, light spilled in like a blessing, and her work, raw, unapologetic, unfinished, gathered in layered brushstrokes across the canvas. No portraits, no likenesses, just colors that bled with emotion, crimson, deep indigo, ochre, burnt umber, and always gold. Clara visited often. She never overstayed, always brought something thoughtful, a jar of homemade jam, a new sketchpad, a newspaper clipping folded with care. One morning she arrived with a question. "Would you ever consider teaching?" Margaret blinked. Clara continued, "There's a community center, a widows group. Most of them don't even know how to read their own wills, let alone fight for what's rightfully theirs. Margaret paused, dipped her brush in ochre, and said quietly, "I'll teach them to sign their names like thunder." The first class met around a circular table with chipped wood and mismatched chairs. 5 women sat in silence at first, eyes flicking nervously toward one another, unsure of their own voices. Margaret began not with law, but with loss. She shared hers. They shared theirs. Then came the paperwork. Then came the anger. Then came the pens. By the 3rd week, they started walking differently, backs straighter, questions sharper. One of them whispered after class, "No one's ever told me I deserved anything before." Margaret only smiled. "You don't need them to." Soon after, a journalist from a national magazine reached out. She'd heard whispers of the Gold Widow, the quiet woman who'd turned grief into grit and taught others to do the same. They met at the cottage over tea and almond biscuits. The writer asked thoughtful questions. Margaret answered most. Some she let hang in the air like brushstrokes unfinished, deliberate, unresolved. Weeks later, the article appeared. Legacy in Gold, The Woman Who Rewrote Widowhood. Margaret read it once, then folded it and tucked it behind her favorite canvas, not to hide it, but to keep it close. That evening, she sat barefoot on the porch, her feet up on the rail, a warm mug in hand, and the lake stretched out like a mirror beneath the pink clouds. The wind shifted gently, bringing with it the smell of pine needles and lake mist. In the distance, a loon cried. Inside, a knock sounded, not loud, but firm. She rose, crossed the room, and opened the door. On the welcome mat, a gold envelope, no name, just a seal pressed into the flap, an embossed emblem of a laurel and a quill. She opened it slowly, carefully. The letter inside read, "You are hereby nominated for the National Legacy Award in recognition of empowerment and legal reform for widowed women." Margaret read the final line twice. "Please confirm your attendance. A seat at the head table awaits." She looked toward the closet, where the gold dress still hung, wrapped in linen and memory. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was stepping into the past. She felt like she was walking toward her name. "They laughed at my dress. Now I wear gold while they wait for crumbs." The chairs were leather. The air smelled like dust and power. And Margaret, wrapped in gold silk, her hair pinned with quiet elegance, sat at the head of the table like a woman who had never been forgotten. Jeremy shifted in his seat. Kelsey wouldn't meet her eyes. This time, Margaret didn't need them to. The law firm's conference room was sun-drenched and sterile. Polished oak table, water pitchers sweating lightly beside crisp stacks of folders. A large framed painting of blindfolded Lady Justice loomed on the back wall. Margaret didn't speak as the guests trickled in. She simply folded her hands atop the document bearing her name. Margaret Elaine Holloway, Last Will and Testament. She'd reviewed it 100 times. The ink was dry. The decisions, irreversible. Wilkins stood beside her in his sharp navy suit, carrying the original sealed envelope. The final version, the one only she had the right to open. Kelsey entered last, her heels clicking across the marble, dressed in a deep navy sheath dress with lips pursed and arms crossed. Jeremy followed, rumpled, hollow-eyed, avoiding both women. They sat not opposite Margaret, but adjacent, off to the side. Margaret took her time uncapping her pen. She tapped it once on the folder, then looked up. "I'll read it aloud," she said. "Some things deserve to be heard by the people who tried hardest not to listen." She unfolded the letter from inside her will, cream paper, handwritten, her cursive firm. "To those who mocked my grief before the grave was even cold." Jeremy's shoulders tightened. "To those who measured my worth by my silence, my wardrobe, or my utility." Kelsey exhaled through her nose, a small scoff escaping. "I offer you not revenge, but reality." Margaret's voice was calm, even. "You wanted inheritance, but you left legacy behind." She looked directly at Kelsey. "You wanted the estate, the history, the image." Her gaze shifted to Jeremy. "You wanted safety, but not responsibility." She folded the letter neatly and looked to Wilkins. "Proceed." Wilkins cleared his throat and began to read the official terms. Margaret's home, now sold, had created a financial surplus. nearly $1.2 million in liquid assets. Of that, $850,000 had already been donated to the Widowed Women's Legal Defense Fund, now bearing her name. A second trust, containing $150,000, had been established for Clara, James's daughter, from his earlier relationship. Another $100,000 was marked for the Westwood Artists Foundation, where Margaret would continue mentoring. Jeremy was granted nothing. Not out of spite, out of conclusion. Kelsey blinked rapidly. This is absurd. You can't just erase blood. Margaret didn't flinch. You were never family, just someone who learned to accessorize guilt. But Jeremy, he's your son. Margaret's voice dipped into something cool and unwavering. He had a choice. Many of them. And every time, he chose your approval over my dignity. Jeremy looked like he wanted to speak, but didn't. The final clause was poetic justice. To those who laughed while I grieved, here's what I left behind. Everything that mattered. Everything you never valued. Wilkins snapped the folder shut. Per her instructions, that concludes the reading. Margaret stood. Her gold dress shimmered faintly in the light, catching the warm tones of